to WMNF on 88.5 FM on WMNF.org and on the WMNF app. I'm Sean Kinane. Today we're going to hear about sea level rise projections based on climate change and based on natural cycles, and how the waterfront might be impacted in St. Petersburg and around the Tampa Bay area. Later on, we're going to hear a news story broken yesterday by WMNF's Daniel Figueroa IV about violence against a student by a Hillsborough County teacher. I will take your phone calls during this show. If you'd like to be among the first, please give us a call at 813-239-9663. You can also email your questions to dj@wmnf.org. You can text 813-433-0885. If you text, please sign your name so we know who's writing in. There are new projections that predict rapid increases in high tide flooding for St. Petersburg over the coming decades. A new research paper in the journal Nature Climate Change projects the number of flooding days for a number of locations, including St. Pete. It finds that there could be as many as 200 high tide flooding days a year by 2060. One of the authors is Gary Mitchum, a physical oceanography professor and an associate dean at the USF College of Marine Science. He joins us here live in the WMNF studios. Welcome to WMNF, Gary.
Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure.
Really glad you could make it. So let's begin with why do we even expect sea levels to rise? What's causing that?
Sea level rise is a change in the volume of the ocean. How much water there is in the ocean, how much space it takes up. The two things are happening. As the Earth's surface is warming, the oceans warm, and the sea level rises because warm water is less dense than cold water. It takes up more space, so the sea level rises. The second thing is the volume of the ocean is increasing because we're melting ice from the land, and that water flows into the ocean. So the combination of the thermal expansion, water taking up more space because it's warmer, and just adding more water to the ocean, that's what we call sea level rise.
And that's one aspect of what we're going to be talking about today. The other is tides. So before we get too deep into the conversation, what are tides and what causes the water to be high or low at a certain time of day or a certain time of year?
Yeah, the tides are just simply due to the gravitational attraction of the sun and also the moon. So we have two kind of tide-producing forces there. And the interesting thing about it is, since we have two things pulling on the water, then we can get high tides due to the sun, high tides due to the moon. And when the two combine and they add up just right, that's when we get what we call spring tides. You know, the highest tides that we get. Now, this happens twice a month. And that's because the Earth and the moon and the sun are kind of on the same line. So it happens at full moon and new moon. There's other cycles that happen when the Earth and the moon and the sun kind of come into better alignment. And one that a lot of people have heard about is a couple of times a year, twice a year, we have what a lot of people refer to as the king tides. That's the spring tides, like we just talked about, but they're larger than the normal ones. So twice per year. What we talked about in this paper says another cycle, which it's once per every 2 decades, roughly, 18.6 years precisely. And in those times, when you're at the high point in that cycle, or the low point, you have the highest spring tides that you can get. And that's when the Earth, moon, and sun are just about perfectly lined up. And that's going to happen next in the 2030s. Right now, in the decade of the 2020s, where we are right now, the alignment is such that that is actually reducing the size of the highest tides. So when we get a minor flooding event, the chances of that happening are not so great now because the tides aren't contributing as much. Sea level rise is contributing. That's going to change by the 2030s. And one of the numbers that you'll see in the paper that we wrote is that the number of minor flooding events that we get in St. Petersburg, this is not a storm surge. This is not water, flowing into your house. It's the water in the streets, maybe making traveling on certain streets difficult. That's going to happen instead of 6 or 7 times a year now in the 20s. We're projecting 67 times, almost 10 times as many in the 2030s. So minor flooding events, but a lot of disruption.
Our guest is Gary Mitchum. He is an associate dean at the USF College of Marine Science. He's also a physical oceanography professor. He's one of the authors on a paper that talks about how St. Pete and other cities might anticipate the number of flooding days for to increase over the coming decades, and why that is. And so that last cycle that you were talking about, in the paper it's referred to as the nodal cycle modulations of tidal amplitude. As you said, it's about a 20-year cycle. Right now we're kind of in a low period, but in a decade or a little bit more than a decade, it's going to be higher. So a tide today would be a little bit higher than it would be okay, so let me start over. If we have a certain tide today based on sea level and based on the moon and the sun, that same tide would be higher in about a decade and a half because of this nodal cycle modulation of tidal amplitude. That means that a tide that wouldn't be flooding now might be flooding in the future, so that adds to the increased number of flooding days that we have, and that has nothing to bear with sea level rise. Now, sea level rise is going to add on top of that. How will sea level rise adding on top of that even increase that number even more?
Well, that's when the number that you talked about earlier in 2060, there's two things going on, of course, the tides and the sea level rise. The amount of sea level rise, the change that we're going to see in the 2020s versus the 2030s is not extremely different. The big difference between those two time periods is that the highest tides are much higher. Okay, so the spring tides are, as I mentioned to you earlier, are super spring tides. So that's the main effect that we're talking about in the coming decade. When you start getting 40 years out, like 2060, then on the high tides, even a normal high tide becomes a flooding event because the sea level rise is going to be much higher then. So as we go into the later part of this century, in the coming decades, sea level rise wins. And even a normal high tide will be a flooding tide.
And in that projection, you looked at NOAA's intermediate projection of sea level rise, and you added on top of that the tidal variations that we've been referring to. And on the high end of that projection, by 2060, there could be 200 days a year where that flooding is exceeded, where it's essentially considered flooding in St. Petersburg. That's not normal, that's not life as we know it. That's completely, radically different than it is today. Today we might get 1 or 2 days a year where it's inconvenient for you to drive into work, but how would that make life different if that happens 200 days a year?
Well, I think the example you just gave is a very good one. For me, where I live, when we have one of these minor flooding events, I have to change my route or may not be able to go to work at high tide. So I have to wait for the water to recede. And so there's disruption. And you have things like when you're persistently, chronically flooding the streets, you're damaging the pavement. So you have infrastructure costs to constant repairs. And things like, well, the roads are flooded, so rather than go out to dinner tonight, I'm going to stay home. So there are economic sort of impacts like that as well. They're all minor, but when you add up, instead of a few times a year to dozens or more times per year, then the damage accumulates.
That also would probably impact other infrastructure, like the way to get rid of stormwater after a big rain. That would probably be damaged by this encroaching tide. Also, the shoreline might be eroded. So these, and I imagine all of these, I guess I'm asking rather than projecting myself, would all of these cumulative impacts make things even worse than we might project otherwise?
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned the stormwater. It's not part of the paper that we're talking about, but if you don't mind if we
Please.
diverge a little bit, I think it's interesting and something a lot of people don't know about, is when we have a hard rainstorm, the stormwater needs to run off. And if the high tide is there, then it can't run off because there's no downhill, basically. So the water will hang up in the streets. So we're all kind of familiar with that. The water doesn't run off after a rainstorm at high tide the way it does at low tide. So if you imagine if we have higher tides chronically, that's going to make runoff more of a problem. The part that I wanted to get into that you and I have not talked about, and I think a lot of people may not know, is that we're also projecting in the future that the extreme rainfall events are going to be more frequent too. And the reason for that is just very simple. It's that warmer air, as the air warms, as we get into warmer and warmer climate, warmer air can hold more water. So if you hold more water, you have more potential to dump a lot of water. So these extreme rainfall rates where we get many inches in an hour are going to become more frequent. And it doesn't matter if it's high tide or low tide. if the rain comes down too fast for the pipes to take it away, you're gonna get flooding in the streets. And that's something that we don't really think about as much. But those kind of extreme rainfall events on top of an extreme high tide, that's when these events become much, much more frequent and probably a little bit higher. The minor flooding events could become moderate flooding events.
Our guest is Gary Mitchum, a physical oceanography professor and associate dean at the USF College of Marine Science. We're talking about sea level rise projections over the next few decades in St. Petersburg and elsewhere in the Bay Area and around the world, of course. And you're listening to WMNF Tampa. My name is Sean Kinane. It's 10:16 in the morning, and we're going to be talking about sea level rise. And if you have any questions, please give us a call. The number to call is 813-239-9663. You can also email your questions to dj@wmnf.org. You can text 813-433-0885. Please sign your name if you do send a text in, because we don't have any way of telling who it is. Right now we have what we might consider, there's times when there's sea levels and there's tides that are really high, and we recognize them as being extreme events. But because of all of these factors that we're adding on top of each other, those could become just routine things that happen very frequently. How does that work?
It's just like you said, when you have things, it's how they add up. And with the tides, the sun effect and the moon effect, when they add up just right, that's when you get the highest tides. And the thing that we're mentioned in this paper as well, that we haven't touched on yet, is that when we talk about having 6 or 7 events per year in the 2020s, going to 67, 70 events in the 2030s, the thing that's interesting is that you have to take into account that those things don't occur uniformly through the year. There are months that are going to be clusters. We call them clusters in the paper, clusters of flooding events. And so we could have some months where you might have 20 events in a single month. Virtually almost every day you're having a high tide flooding event, and other months. And that's because of this other cycle that I mentioned, the twice per year, that adds up on the same sort of thing. The season of the year matters, because I mentioned when we were talking about sea level rise at the beginning, part of the reason for sea level rise is because the water is warmer, it stands higher because it's less dense, takes up more volume, takes up more space. Well, the same thing happens in the winter and summer. Winter, the water is cold and it sits lower. Summertime, the water is warmer and it sits a little higher. So when you have the high tide events in the summer, you also have the kind of the normal summertime warming adds into it as well. All of these different contributors to how high the water is at high tide, they can cluster together in different ways. And one of the things we emphasized in the paper is that even in the 2030s, having 70 events in a year, there's also the chance of having 2 or 3 months where most of those events happen. So good news for the other 9 months, but during those 3 months, it's going to be very difficult to function in some of our neighborhoods.
Yeah, so how would the clustering impact people's lives? If there's no choice about it, but if you were designing something and you could choose, you probably would want it spread out more. But if in reality they're clustered, why would that make things more inconvenient for people?
Well, it means I mentioned earlier for myself, when we have one of these minor events, it makes it difficult for me to get to my office or go to the grocery store or go out to meet my friends for dinner or something. And we're now talking about that happening in a given month, 1 or 2 months, almost every high tide. And so now you have to actually arrange your entire day, all your activities, arrange it around the tide cycle. So I think whoever makes the tidal charts, if they're doing it for money, they're going to make a fortune.
Unfortunately. Our guest is Gary Mitchum. He's a physical oceanography professor and associate dean at the USF College of Marine Science. We're talking about projections for sea level rise. And this clustering, it has to also, I would guess, I'm not an expert on this, but it seems like the more frequent that things are happening close together with these high water events, let's say you have some sort of infrastructure that's saturated with water because of this clustering, like the shoreline, and then before it even dries out, there's another wave of high tide, or the pipes that carry the wastewater away. Before all the water's cleared, now there's another high tide that has to take a beating on the infrastructure.
Yeah, one of the examples I use is that when I walk around my neighborhood, there are lots of areas where you can see where the low spots are, where the high tide flooding gets on the streets. The pavement is cracked, it's potholes, they're constantly being repaired. Now you can think about them, the pothole opens up, and you can't even repair it because you're gonna have another high tide in a few hours. And so the infrastructure cost, to repairing all of that pavement, there's a substantial amount of money involved. And so on top of that, there's also as I said, the effect on businesses, of people staying home instead of moving around and going out. But the infrastructure cost, it's a phrase that I've used to tell people about this in the past is, yes, these are minor flooding events. This is not a major storm surge, hurricane, water flowing over your house, which is very important too. I'm not downplaying that. But these minor flooding events, it's wrong to say, well, it's just an annoyance. It's just an inconvenience. Because the infrastructure cost, it's the death by 1,000 cuts. So it might not cost that much to fix the road, but when you have to fix the road every month, then the costs are going to mount up.
So given all of these things that we've been talking about, one of the sentences in your paper, it says, such transitions, and we're talking here about the transitions from kind of a gradual rate of frequency of these high tide floods to a sudden spike in frequency. Such transitions have the potential to produce acute impacts in unsuspecting and underprepared communities if they're not identified in advance and communicated to stakeholders and decision makers. So I want to ask if that's happening. Is this threat being communicated to stakeholders? That means people living there, business owners, and decision makers. Do people in power in St. Petersburg and in the state of Florida and elsewhere, do they have this information, and are they making those right decisions?
I think here in St. Petersburg we've